Hello and welcome. I am the Baron, and this is the Baron's Bestiary. You know what? Actually appropriate with the ponies. Well, horses would go in a bestiary, logically. Now, this is a new type of talk. I've really wanted to do these kind of talks since I literally started YouTube. This was literally the video series I really wanted to do. And what I'll be doing is I'll be exploring video games, TV and film, and many more sources, and looking at monsters, demons, the enemies you meet, and the creatures you fight, looking at the original sources and finding out where they actually came from originally, and then working out, have video games and films taught us to defeat these enemies appropriately? So, let's get stuck in. I decided that the first 3 videos in this series would be focusing on the 3 primary fantasy races that you meet, and what are they, where do they come from, and why should we care? So, starting right off, the Elves. But that's not their only name, is it? The Fae, Fair Folk, inhabitants of Fairy World, Alp. Now that one might catch with a few people who play The Witcher, because the Alp in The Witcher is actually a vampire. That's important because the Alp is actually what the Germans call fairies. So the fact that that's been turned into a vampire is very telling of the guys that make Witcher, and we'll get into that in a bit. There are so many names for these creatures, and in modern fantasy they have become the near immortal, beautiful, benevolent creatures of magic who help and advise the heroes, who may go and use their bows to help and save the world, and these are wonderful, great creatures. But here's the question to ask. Are these modern elves, these modern thoughts, the kind of elves that our ancestors told stories of? No. I'm not even going to go into any detail on why that for an answer. Just no. There are so many videos explaining why the elves we have today are not the elves our ancestors had. And it is way too much for me to go into in one video. I would be here for 2 hours if I went into the entire history of elves. So, no, I'm not going to go into the massive detail that I really want to, because there's no point. There's too much. So what this video is actually going to be doing is prefacing modern day elves, not elves. And I'll be commenting back to this whenever we come across a real elf. So what is a real elf? They were monsters of beauty and starlight that snuck into people's houses and stole their children, leaving changelings that were nearly human but not quite. Now you might have heard that before, changelings. What that is an elf child raised as a human, and realistically speaking the original story was probably some village somewhere in England or Scandinavia or Germany, because those are the main places that the elves and fairies come from. Probably had a child who maybe had Down syndrome, or maybe they were a bit autistic, or had some kind of very mild disability, not enough to make them go, this is a monster, make them go, this kid's not quite right. They're away with the fairies. Elves, fairies. In original English, elf and fairy is the same word. But again, we'll get to that. They were the otherworldly beings that tempted and bade mortals come play for the amusement of the king and queen of the fairy folk. To the Norse, they were no more than a nuisance, a precursor to the mythical monsters of the ice giants. But I've often seen people say that where we get this idea of high elf and dark elf, or light elf and dark elf, World of Warcraft, night elf and blood elf, we get that idea from the Norse. The light elves, or the, I'm probably going to butcher this, Jolsvar, and the dark elves, the Darkalfar. And it should be noted that actually some scholars think that the stories of the Darkalfar, the Dark Elves, are where the Norse got a lot of their stories for the dwarves. But I personally don't think so. I think the dwarves are a separate entity because there's not enough crossover. The only part where the Dark Elves and the dwarves crossover is that they live underground. Otherwise, that's it. In Ireland and the rest of Britain, though, this wasn't the case. They weren't just nuisances having their own war while the gods dealt with them and looked after humans. What we would call light elves is actually seelie, and what we would call the dark elves is unseelie. And these were the fairy court. Visually, there was no difference between the two, which again is different to the Norse. There was no physical difference, visual difference between the light fae and the dark fae. It was just the name seelie and unseelie. And what that meant was, are they benevolent and kind, or are they cruel and vicious? But that is too simple. Because the seelie weren't benevolent. The seelie appeared benevolent, rewarding, aiding heroes in stories, but they weren't. They were still as vicious and capacity for cruelty that the unseelie had. It was the seelie that took away Tamlin. It was the seelie that tricked Cuchulainn. It was the seelie who cursed many of the other Irish legends. The seelie... There's so many stories with the seelie where they be approachful and kind and give gifts and things like that. But the second that you were even remotely disrespectful, bang, you're dead. So in that sense, when we're talking about fairies and elves, Maleficent, seelie. She was only cruel when she was disrespected, when she wasn't invited. So that is something to think on. The Dark Elves, or the Unseelie, on the other hand, were very overtly evil. You didn't need to be rude for them to be cruel. They liked cruelty. They liked being horrible to humans. Humans were their toys and playthings. But that's no different to the Seelie again. The Seelie saw humans as their toys and playthings, but more like pets, whereas the Unseelie saw them more as slaves. Examples of Unseelie, and you'll probably have heard a few of these. The Banshee of Scotland. That's an Unseelie. The Headless Horseman, or Dullahan, that's an Unseelie. These are all elves. Another one that's elves, the Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt, I'm going to do a whole video on what the Wild Hunt was, and if it's correct in Witcher, and I'm just going to say, for the most part, they're not far wrong. But the original Wild Hunt were Unseelie. They were dark elves, or dark fairies, dark fae. There are so many forms that elves take to trick and cloy their way into the minds of men and mortals. It would be impossible to do a video on just the elves. So, like I said, I'm touching on a few details just to give you a base idea, and I'll be referencing back to this whenever I come across something that is an elf or a fairy. Sorry, I'm clearly very lazy. I only want to do thousands of these videos and just want a quick reference sheet. What I will question of where did the modern thinking of elves are beautiful and benevolent come from, it's always been here. Humans, especially the Celts and the Gauls, so England and Germany, always had this image of the elves being beautiful, benevolent, kind, giving. But they also had all these stories of how they could be cruel and callous. It was a warning of the prior generation, do not trust these things, and in the next generation, trusted the thing. And it's not because children don't listen to their elders. In those day and ages, you listen to the druids, you listen to the village elder, you listen to the wise woman. What is the problem? Elves are beautiful. I'm actually going to use a quote by Terry Pratchett for this. Elves are wonderful. They provoke wonder. Elves are marvellous. They cause marvels. Elves are fantastic. They create fantasies. Elves are glamorous. They project glamour. Elves are enchanting. They weave enchantment. Elves are terrific. They beget terror. The thing about words is that meanings can twist, just like a snake, and if you want to find snakes, you look at them behind words that have changed their meaning. No one ever said that elves are nice. Elves are bad. And that is so important. It's only actually been since Shakespeare's day that the bad aspects of elves and fairies have slowly been forgotten and removed, all the way into Victorian Romanticism, which then led into the Tolkien elves that we know today as being nigh immortal, beautiful, benevolent and magical. As such, any kind of elf that isn't inherently evil, vicious, cruel, or cunning, and in some way alien or otherworldly, is not an elf or a fairy. It's probably closer to a half-elf, or possibly even a changeling from the original mythology. But what these things are not elves. They don't have the capacity for this level of cruelty. With one exception in Tolkien's story, actually. Lady Galadriel. Lady Galadriel I very adamantly see as a Seelie, because of that transformation sequence she can have where she goes from beautiful and ethereal to evil and ethereal. And that to me feels like an elf who is trying to fight her calling, her nature. But that's just it, that's how elves get back in. That's how elves get back into the minds of men and mortals. That's how we start having children be taken from houses and we blame it on the elves. That's how we get humans as slaves and that sort of thing. Elves are dangerous, and I think this modern thinking of what an elf is even more dangerous. The old stories are there to teach us, and this concept of them becoming good is bad. You might also be wondering where we get the idea of Santa's elves from. Those are actually pixies and gnomes. Those are, again, old stories of a creature very similar, but pixies and gnomes are exclusively benevolent for the most part. A little bit trickster, a bit more childly. Elves. Santa's elves. So I'm from now on calling them Santa's pixies, or Santa's gnomes. I can't say, so many versions have one wearing the red hat. So, in conclusion, thank you for partaking in my semi-paranoid elven ramblings. Genuinely, elves scare me, especially how we all seem to accept that they are good and beautiful. If I mention an elven race in a future video, I will relate back to this one, and I'll be calling them by what I find, so Seelie, Unseelie, Light Elf, Dark Elf, depending on where they originate, Norse or Germanic England. So, please like and subscribe. Please comment any monsters or mythology you would like me to talk about. Links and resources in the descriptions below, and as always, get out of my house. Bye!